Well, good morning. If you like, you can go ahead and make your way over to John chapter 8. We'll pick up in verse 31 in just a little bit. But as you make your way there, it is a beautiful, beautiful Lord's Day. It definitely seems like spring is not just right around the corner, but it seems like it's right here, although it is a little bit cooler than what I'm used to for spring in Houston. It seems like it's normally, well into, the 80s, 90s by this point. But I'm really, really enjoying this beautiful weather, and it is so good to be together this morning. If you're visiting, we're especially glad that you're here and that you have come to be a part of our worship this morning. And I've noticed each Sunday it seems like it's just grown a little bit fuller and fuller. People are getting their vaccines, and so we're finally able to have more among our numbers, and it seems like things are continuing in that direction, and so that's really exciting. But it is just so good to be together, and especially this morning, that's one of my favorite songs, "A Shield About Me," and certainly God is a shield about us right now as we are all gathered together on this Lord's Day. We're continuing in our series this morning on why believe. And in the first part of this series, we sort of looked at why believe, reasons to believe, evidence to believe that Christianity is true. And in the second part of the latter half of this series, we're looking at, why should we want Christianity to be true? Because many people would say, if I can get everything that I need, if society can get everything that it needs from a secular worldview, then why pursue Christianity? Why believe if I can get all these things that I want and I desire from this other worldview? And I guess really the question that we're getting at is, what does Christianity have to offer that the secular worldview can't provide? And so that's what we're going to look at this morning. A couple weeks back, we looked at how Christianity provides a meaning that cannot be taken from you. Last week, we talked about how Christianity provides us with an identity and a sense of belonging as we are a son or a daughter of God. And this morning, we're looking at freedom. And of all the topics in this series, I think this one might be the most counterintuitive. Because I think most people would say, they would think of Christianity, what could possibly be more restrictive and limiting than religion? How do religion and freedom go together at all? And there's actually a quote that I think really sort of fills this in well. This is a part of what was called the atheist bus campaign. This went on in England. I think it was in the early 2000s. But you can see at the top, the guy standing there, that's Richard Dawkins, who we've already cited a couple times in this series, the very strident, passionate atheist. But he was a part of this campaign, and at the top of this bus, and there were several of these around London, it says, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life." And it looks like he's really enjoying his life there. He looks very happy. But I think what this gets at is really the heart of where our culture is at, where people are coming from. They see Christianity as this oppressive ideology that imposes its standards on other people, and that it really just holds people back from their desires, from their wants, and from their potential. And so you have someone like Dawkins saying this, and I want to be upfront that the Bible, of course, does say a lot about commands, right? It tells us a lot about how we ought to live in the world, and that's no secret. But while the Bible does give us instructions about how we should live and how we should behave in the world, the Bible actually says a lot about freedom too. 2 Corinthians 3:17, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Or the passage that we read from a moment ago in Galatians 5, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And we could look all over the New Testament, but in the Old Testament too, right? We have the Exodus story, the deliverance of an entire nation from slavery. or the year of Jubilee where debts were forgiven and slaves were set free, which is why Jesus says in Luke 4 that I've come to bring the ultimate Jubilee, that this is the whole reason I came, to set at liberty the captives and to set free those who are oppressed. And so on one hand, we have people like Dawkins saying, if there's no God, then we can finally stop worrying and we can just enjoy life. And then on the other hand, we have the Bible saying all these things about freedom. And with these two competing ideas, maybe the question that we really need to be asking this morning is, well, what does it really mean to be free? What does it really mean to be free? And how would you answer that question? Think about the moments in your life where you have felt the most free, because I think freedom is a difficult word to define. It's sort of hard to put a finger on exactly what it is, but we know what it feels like, right? We know that experience of joy and peace and comfort and relief and all these different things that come attached to this word freedom. So it's kind of hard to define, but we know what it feels like. And so what does it really mean to be free? And there's a really well-known, highly influential poet and thinker. She comes from a royal family. You may recognize her name. This is Elsa from the movie Frozen. And this is in her number one hit song, Let It Go. I think that's the title of it. And she says, "No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free." And we know the song, right? I'll spare you from singing it, but let it go, can't hold me back anymore. That's kind of the current understanding of what it means to be free. Just this unlimited, unbounded freedom. There are no boundaries, there are no barriers or restrictions or limits placed on my life. That I am totally my own autonomous being, and I can shake off the oppressive rule of whatever arbitrary ideas might be placed in my life, that I'm just totally free to be whoever I want to be. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. And to add to that a little bit more, to fill in that a little bit more, the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, he says this. He says, "We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists." This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately, he says, liberating and exhilarating. We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct the answers ourselves. And that kind of builds on the foundation of the last couple lessons, the idea of meaning and identity. But I think you see how that relates to freedom too. What he's saying is freedom is all about the ability to create myself, to essentially create my own reality, to be whoever I want to be, to do whatever I want to do, as long as it doesn't harm other people, as long as it doesn't infringe on the freedom of others. And so why can't we just live life like that? Just experience the freedom of constructing the answers ourselves. And you can even hear this idea in some of the like expressions we use. And I don't think that this is all bad. I think we know what we mean when we say it, but I think it also contributes to this idea when we say, just follow your heart. The idea that there are no boundaries, there's nothing holding you back. Like Dawkins said, there's probably no God. So whatever it is that you're feeling inside, whatever desires, whatever your heart most wants, follow that to its end. Just break through the barriers, break free, be whoever you want to be. Just enjoy life. Just follow your heart, because that's what it means to be you, and being you is what it really means to be free. And so that's sort of the postmodern idea of freedom, that freedom is the idea of being without any restraints, no boundaries or barriers. And that sounds really great at first. I think there's a part of us that really wants that. We want to be our own autonomous being and to just sort of live for ourselves. But I think there are at least a couple problems with it. And I would say, first of all, the first problem is that it's unrealistic. And what I mean by that is there was a commencement speech in 2005, that was given by a renowned postmodern novelist, a completely secular thinker. But in this commencement speech, he said this. He said, here's something that's weird but true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice that we get is what to worship. So think about what he's saying here. Again, this is an entirely secular thinker, this postmodern novelist. And what he's saying is, well, we have freedom, but really the only true freedom that we have is the freedom to choose what we worship, what we give attention to, what we sacrifice for, and what we build our life around. And there are all kinds of criteria that we might use for that. Worship what makes you feel good. Worship what makes you happy. Worship what brings you meaning and significance. Worship what makes other people value and praise and respect and admire you. Worship what makes you feel important or what makes you feel loved and gives you that sense of belonging. And maybe it's not one of those things, maybe it's something else or a combination of those things. But the idea is that we all worship something. And so the idea that I just have this unlimited, unbounded freedom and I can just be my own autonomous being and live for myself, it's just really not true. It's unrealistic because we all worship something. But not only is it unrealistic, it's also unfulfilling. It's unfulfilling. And I don't know if this is the best analogy of that, but the analogy that I've heard before sort of used for this is, think about when a guy loves a girl, right? We've heard this story, right? A guy loves a girl and somehow he convinces her to say yes, and almost immediately he's giving up all kinds of freedoms, right? He can't just live however he wants. He has to think about her needs and her likes and dislikes and her interests and what she wants to do. And so he's giving up all these freedoms, and he can't just say whatever he wants. He's got to think about her thoughts and her emotions and her feelings. And so we get this idea that when he enters into this relationship, he's given up all kinds of liberty. He's submitting his life to her. And so on the outside, what do we say? We say things like, he's whipped, right? Or we'll say, old ball and chain, right? We'll poke fun at that idea. But to him, it's not like that at all, right? To him, that's what it really means to be free. It doesn't feel like he's following rules or commands or that he's being ordered around. To him, that's the experience that's truly liberating. And it doesn't have to be romantic relationships, but in anything, we realize this idea that when we are the most fulfilled, when we really feel the most free, it's when we're connected with other people. And that by nature means some kind of submission. And so to say that I'm going to live for myself, I'm going to, be my own autonomous being and just do whatever my heart desires, not only is that unrealistic, but it's also unfulfilling because it's actually in those committed relationships that we feel the most free. And so that's sort of the postmodern idea of freedom, this ultimate freedom to live however I want as long as it doesn't infringe on the freedom of others. And we maybe see how that's unrealistic and unfulfilling. And so Jesus, he offers an alternative. And that alternative, I think the best example of that is in John chapter 8. And so if you're not there, you can go ahead and turn there in your Bibles to John 8. We'll pick up in verse 31. But as you make your way there, I just want to sort of set the stage. This conversation that we're about to read, it happens during what's called the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles was when the Jewish people, they would dwell in tents. They would go out of their houses and they would dwell in tents for 7 days to remind them of when God delivered them from slavery in Egypt and dwelt among them as they journeyed through the wilderness. And so you can imagine ancient Jerusalem is swarming with thousands of people, and there's the conversation is just buzzing because at this point Jesus is well into his ministry. And as Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, the tension between he and the religious authorities is rising. And throughout this week, people are very confused and divided on what to make of Jesus. And so after a very eventful week of this week-long celebration, Jesus, he finally says on the last day of this Feast of Tabernacles, he says this, and it's so interesting. He says, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. All right, now what is Jesus getting at with this statement? Because at first when we see this kind of sounds a lot like the critique, the problem that a lot of people have with religion, right? Obey these rules, follow my commands, obey my voice, listen to this arbitrary moral standard of truth that I'm imposing on you. That's the critique that many people have of Christianity. And that's what's pushing a lot of people away from the church. And so what is Jesus really getting at with this phrase, the truth will set you free? Well, it's a loaded statement, and I want to come back around to it at the end. I think it'll sort of click at the end, and it'll kind of make more sense. But for now, I just want to look at how they respond. Because you can imagine that as they hear Jesus say this, you can imagine their response. If Jesus is saying the truth will set you free, well, what does that mean? It means that they're not free. It means that they're slaves. And so they fire back at Jesus. They say, we are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. So how is it that you say you will become free? Now, right away, we all realize that this is just super not true. We all watched Prince of Egypt, right? We remember the Exodus story. They were slaves in Egypt for like 400 years. Throughout their history, they were enslaved to all these different nations, and even now, they're essentially slaves to Rome. And so how is it that they could say this? How could they think that they've never been enslaved? And I think that the answer to that is that, well, they still maintained their cultural identity. They still maintained their religious system. They still maintained their traditions and way of life. And so it's like, while they were under the control of Rome, they still had control of this little corner, this little small space within the empire, this pocket of Palestine. They still had control of their own little world. And so to them, it felt like they were free when in reality, that just wasn't true at all. And that's the same delusion that we're often under, right? We think that we're in control. We think that we're just living for ourselves and following our heart's desires, when in reality, it's just like David Foster Wallace said, that we all worship something. Everybody worships. And so Jesus, realizing this truth, he says to this crowd of people who think that they've never been enslaved, that they're totally free, he says to them this. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. And I want to focus just for a moment on that word sin. When I think about sin, I feel like I often think of it as sort of external behavior. I think of sin as like this list of things that God says don't do, that these things are bad, don't break these rules, and certainly that's part of it. But what Jesus is saying here is that sin is about more than an external action, it's an internal power. It's a kind of force inside you that controls you and that owns you like a master owns a slave. And Jesus is saying that's the reality that everyone is living in. Spiritual slavery, chained and whipped by the emotional, the spiritual, and often even physical abuses of a life lived for something other than God. And maybe that sounds intense, maybe that sounds a little over the top to call it slavery, but listen to what that same novelist, to what that same postmodern author said in that same commencement speech. Listen to how real and honest he is about this. He says, everybody worships, and pretty much anything you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. He says, worship power, you'll end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. That is spiritual slavery. And we all know what that feels like. And maybe we don't think about it that way. Maybe we don't think about it as slavery, but we know that experience. We know what it's like to be a slave to sin, where it makes us feel miserable. And we feel worthless and corrupt inside. It changes who we are in the way that we think and the way that we act. We've all had that experience of what it's like to be a slave to sin. And so listen to what Jesus is saying here. What Jesus is saying is, look, we all worship something, and anything that we worship will eat us alive. It will consume us. That's the reality that we're living in, this spiritual slavery, this spiritual bondage. And so if that's the reality of our existence, that we all submit to something, that we all worship something, then what is Jesus really getting at here? What's Jesus' message to this crowd of people? What is Jesus' vision for what it really means to be free? And I think the answer to that is found in this last verse, in verse 35, when Jesus finally, he looks out to this crowd of people and he says this. He says, the slave does not remain in the house forever, but the son remains forever. Now, that's kind of a strange statement, and we'll look at that. We'll sort of break that down in just a second, but look at the last part of what he says. The son remains forever, so if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. What does that mean? If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Do you remember that analogy from a moment ago about how it's often in relationships that we feel the most free, the most liberated, when we're in those committed relationships? Well, that's really only true if it's reciprocal, right? That's really only true if both people are doing that, right? If one person says, I will change for you, I will submit to you, I will work and sacrifice and all these things for you. If one person says that and the other person doesn't, that's just exploitation. That's slavery. And sadly, I think that's the perception and that's the problem that many people have with God. That God is this, their perception of God is that he's this almighty, authoritative being, that it's my way or the highway, you follow my rules or get lost, you obey my commands and listen to my voice. And so I have to do all the submitting, I have to do all the change and the sacrifice and the humbling of myself, I have to put in all the work. And that's why people like Dawkins say that Christians could never really enjoy life, because they see God as this harsh, oppressive ruler. But Jesus has a different idea in mind. Look at what Jesus is saying here in verse 36 when he says, the Son sets you free. The Feast of Tabernacles, like we mentioned a moment ago, this was about this celebration when they would remember how God delivered them from slavery in Egypt and how he dwelt among them in the wilderness. And so what Jesus is really saying when he says the Son sets you free, what he's saying is, I am the deliverer who has come to dwell among you. Like John 1:14 says, the word, the truth became flesh and dwelt among us, or literally tabernacled among us. And not only did he take on flesh, but Philippians 2 says he took on the form of a servant. He took on the form of a slave. And he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so Jesus, he becomes a slave. He is oppressed. He is chained and whipped. He receives the punishment of a slave so that you could be liberated. Jesus is nailed down to a cross so that you could be set free. Jesus dies so that you can have life. The Son sets you free. And so when I become a Christian, it's not that I'm submitting my life to a set of these arbitrary rules. I'm submitting my life to a person. I'm submitting my life to a relationship. And it's not oppression. It's not exploitation. Because what God is saying in the cross, what God is saying as he is crucified and he's paying that debt of sin, our debt of sin, what God is saying on that cross is, I will change for you. I will take on flesh. I will suffer. I will be oppressed for you. I will submit and serve and sacrifice. I will give my life, my all for you. The Son sets you free. And so what does it really mean to be free? What does it really mean to experience that joy and that peace and relief and comfort and all those things that we mean when we say that word? What is true freedom? Well, I think what this passage is getting at is this, that true freedom is submitting my life to the Son who sacrificed his life for me. True freedom is when I submit my life to the Son who sacrificed his life for me. And again, maybe that sounds paradoxical, maybe that sounds counterintuitive, and we kick against it because we kick against that idea of submission. But again, everybody submits to something, right? That's the very first commandment, right? You shall have no other gods before me. What does that mean? It means that there's no alternative. You either worship the God or you worship some other God. You either worship Jehovah God or some false God, but there's no in between. And the only master who can provide you with the security and the meaning and the significance and hope and all these things that we're really searching for, the only master who will fulfill you is the Son. Because he's the only master who laid down his life. He's the only master who sacrificed his life for me. One author and evangelist, Tim Keller, he put it this way, that Jesus is the only master who, when you find him, he fulfills you, and when you fail him, he forgives you. Every other master that I might submit my life to, I may find joy and satisfaction and meaning in it for a moment. And it might even be good things. I might give my life to some really great cause, but in the end, it's only temporary. And it will only take from us the more and more that we lean on it and depend on it. And in the end, it will leave us totally empty. These other masters, they cannot fulfill you. And not only that, all these other masters, when you fail them, they will punish you. If I build my life, if we build our life around achievement or success or prestige, then when I fail that test or when I don't get that promotion at work or I don't make that sports team or whatever it might be, when I lose out on those things, I'll feel miserable. I won't just be upset, I'll feel worthless. And if I build my life around relationships and I find meaning and a sense of belonging with other people, then when I disappoint them or I let them down in some way or I lose them for whatever reason it might be, then I won't just be sad, I'll be distraught. I'll feel like life itself has ended. And that is the slave master beating you. You can feel the whips on your back. But Jesus is the only master who, when you find him, he fulfills you. And when you fail him, he forgives you. And that, I think, is really what he's saying in verse 35. Right? That interesting phrase that the slave doesn't remain forever. The slave has no belonging. The slave has no permanence. The slave has no place in the house. The slave is just to be used and to be exploited for whatever resources it can give to the master. And when it's not producing anymore, when the slave isn't performing up to the task that the master desires, it can be discarded, it can be done away with or abused or whatever it might be, no questions asked. But Jesus says that's not how it is with God. That you're not a slave, you're a son. You're a son, you're a daughter, and a son has a place. The son has an inheritance. The son is loved and cared for and provided for. The slave doesn't remain forever, but the son remains forever. And if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And that is true freedom. Submitting my life to the son who sacrificed his life for me. And so as we close this morning, I just want to give one picture of that. In the early 2000s, there was a movie that came out that was set in Sierra Leone in West Africa. And it's a brutal, war-torn country. It's still like that in many ways today. And we actually have brothers and sisters over there. We have Christians over there. Some people at Lost River are in contact with them. They have a Facebook page. But even to this day, it's a very difficult, would be an understatement, but a very difficult, oppressive environment. But in this movie, in Sierra Leone, there are a group of men who invade these villages, and they essentially take these children as slaves. And they brainwash them to become a part of their army, to become a part of their militia, and they train them to do all kinds of horrible things. But in this film, toward the end of this movie, there's this scene where there's a 12-year-old boy. And he's one of the boys who had been taken captive by these horrible people. And he's holding this gun in his hands, and it's pointed at his own father. And so this father, staring at this hardly recognizable son, in shock and in disbelief, the father says this. He says, Dia, what are you doing? Dia, look at me. What are you doing? You are Dia Vindi of the proud Mindi tribe. You are a good boy who loves soccer and school. Your mother loves you so much, she waits by the fire making plantains and red palm oil stew with your sister Nyanda and the new baby. The cows wait for you, and Babu, the wild dog who minds no one but you. And then he says, I know they made you do bad things, but you are not a bad boy. I am your father who loves you, and you will come home with me and be my son again. And with tears in his eyes, this boy, he sets down the gun and he runs into the arms of his father. And he's free. And what was it that set this boy free? it was the truth. It was the Father looking at this Son and saying, look at me, that this is not who you are. That you're not a slave to these awful masters, that you are my Son and I am your Father and I love you so much. And what I want us to see this morning is that is the truth that will set us free. And like Jesus started in verse 31, that is the truth. Those are the words that we need to abide in every day, reminding ourselves that we're not a slave to sin. That no matter what we've done, no matter how far we've gone from home, that we are not a slave to these awful masters. We're not a slave to sin. We are a son. We are a daughter of our Father in heaven who loves us so, so much. Loves us so much that he gave us his only Son. That whosoever believes in him, whoever trusts in him, whoever submits their life to him will not perish, but have eternal life. A place, a home to remain in the house of the Father forever. True freedom is submitting my life to the Son who sacrificed his life for me. A love so amazing, so divine, it demands my soul, my life, my all. So if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, I hope that this lesson shows you that we all have to submit our lives to something. We all live for something, and that anything that we submit our life to other than God, it will leave us so empty. But this morning you can come and you can submit your life to Christ in baptism, and you can experience that freedom from sin. You don't have to be a slave to sin anymore. Or if you're here this morning and you need our prayers or you need our support or assistance in whatever way it might be, however we can help you this morning, we ask that you come right now as together we stand and sing.